This is K.M. Weiland, and you're listening to the 534th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, Archetypal Character Arcs, Part 1, a new series. Archetypal stories are stories that transcend themselves. Archetypes speak to something larger. They are archetypal exactly because they are too large. They are larger than life. They are impossible, but ring with probability. They utilize a seeming representation of the finite as a mirror through which to glimpse infinitude. Despite their almost numinous quality, archetypes are a very real force in our practical world. Think of it this way. All the things we imagine actually exist. Aliens, vampires, dragons, fairies, all the memories of our actual reality also exist in real time in the same way. Regardless whether these things can be proven as corporeal, they still exist within the human experience and impact it. The deeper the shared belief, the deeper and more meaningful the archetype becomes. Stories are one of our most powerful modes of exploring archetypes. This is true, as we've talked about elsewhere, in the very nature of story itself, and more specifically, in the patterns of plot and character arc structure that are revealed in the studies of story theory. But archetypes show up in a legion of increasingly smaller ways, everything from book genres to iconic character types to symbolic imagery. For a writer, one of the most exciting explorations of archetype can be found within specific character arcs or journeys. These arcs have defined our literature throughout history, and they can be consciously used by any writer to strengthen plot, identify themes, explore life, and resonate with readers. With today's episode, I will be beginning a lengthy series that will start by exploring 6 particular positive change character arcs. They are the maiden, the hero, the queen, the king, the crone, and the mage. These archetypes are not random, but sequential, marking out what we might see as the 3 acts of the human life. If we think of the average human life as lasting 90 years, then we can also think of that life in terms of 3 acts made up of 30 years each. The first act, or the first 30 years, is represented by the youthful arcs of the maiden and the hero, and can be thought of thematically as a time of individuation. The second act, roughly years 30 to 60, is represented by the mature arcs of the queen and the king, and it can be thought of thematically as a time of integration. The third act, roughly years 60 through 90, is represented by the elder arcs of the crone and the mage, and can be thought of thematically as a time of transcendence. In her book, Women Who Run with the Wolves, Clarissa Pinkola Estes alludes to how these 6 archetypes, although she uses different names, are foundational to the human experience. She says, the gardener, the king, and the magician are 3 mature personifications of the archetypal masculine. They correspond to the sacred trinity of the feminine, personified by the maiden, mother, and crone. For the purpose of our study, it is important to note up front that each of these 6 character arcs will build upon the previous ones to create the big picture of one single life arc. The partner arcs within the same act are not interchangeable but distinct. That is, the maiden and the hero are not simply gendered names for the same arc, and they can be undertaken by any person of any gender or age, which we'll talk about at the end of the episode. Each of these archetypes represents a positive change arc, such as I talk about in my book, Creating Character Arcs. Later, we will also be examining the negative change arcs represented by the passive and aggressive archetypal poles for each type. For example, the bully and coward as the negative aspects of the hero, as well as the flat arc periods that exist between the positive change arcs. For example, the lover, the parent, the ruler, etc. Although all of these archetypes are deeply familiar to us, only one, the hero, is noted for having a prominently recorded archetypal journey. Most writers these days are steeped in the mythology, both ancient and modern, and the canonized beat sheets of the hero's journey. Now, I can't speak specifically to every writer's relationship to the hero's journey, but I can speak to mine, which I dare say may indeed be similar to many people's. Basically, I grew up engulfed in the hero's journey, and I loved it. I resonated with it, played it out in the backyard with great gusto, and recreated it in my own stories. But then I started reading about it in writing tomes, and somehow didn't quite resonate with it. Even though its beats clearly lined up with classic structure, I couldn't help but feel a little claustrophobic about the whole thing. Although many of the terms I now use in teaching story structure have been borrowed from the classic hero's journey, I have never specifically taught the hero's journey or even consciously tried to apply it to my own stories. I always felt like something was missing. And then, a few years ago, at the suggestion of a word player, I read Kim Hudson's The Virgin's Promise, which posits a feminine partner arc to the hero's journey. In the book, she also reaffirmed Clarissa Pinkola Estes' point previously about the maiden and the hero being the youthful journeys, which should, in a mature life, be followed by the journeys of adulthood and elderhood. So, in short, the hero's journey is anything but all-encompassing. It may be universal in the sense that it represents an archetypal pattern that shows up in all our lives, but it is literally only one of multiple important life arcs. Kapow! Mind blown! As depth psychologist Jean Shinoda Bolen puts it, I had a sense of experiencing something beyond ordinary reality, something numinous, which is a characteristic of an archetypal experience. Not long after, as I began researching this series, I read The Hero with 1,000 Faces, Joseph Campbell's famed master text for the hero's journey, and I was delighted to realize that what he describes as the hero's journey is in fact a microcosm of all 6 life arcs. He talks about the stages of the journey like this, and you can see how they align with the 6 life arcs as well as 2 bookending archetypes. So he talks about the transformations of the hero. Number 1 is the primordial hero and the human, which can be seen to align with the flat archetype of the child. Number 2 is the childhood of the human hero, which can be seen to align with the maiden arc. Number 3 is the hero as warrior, which can be seen to align with the hero. Number 4 is the hero as lover, which can be seen to align with the queen arc. Number 5 is the hero as emperor and as tyrant, which can be seen to align with the king arc. Number 6 is the hero as world redeemer, which can be seen to align with the crone arc. Number 7 is the hero as saint, which can be seen to align with the mage arc. And number 8 is the departure of the hero, which can be seen to align with the ending saint archetype. Indeed, Carol S. Pearson notes in her Awakening the Heroes Within that the 3 stages of the hero's journey, preparation, journey, return, parallel exactly the stages of human psychological development. So not only did the exemplary work of all of these wonderful authors completely change how I view and plot my own stories, it also changed the way I view my life. Recognizing and studying all of these archetypes and identifying which journey I am personally working on in my own life has proven to be a profound initiatory experience. And truly, that is the point of any good archetypal character arc. Clarissa Pinkola Estes says, "Archetype changes us. If there is no change, there has been no real contact with the archetype." So if you've studied character arcs with me before, then you already know that the essence of any character arc is change. Archetype, as Estes notes, adds the element of changing the reader, or at least by its very nature offering the opportunity to do so. And this is because all 6 of the archetypal arcs we will be discussing here are initiatory arcs. And by that, I specifically mean they concern themselves on both a personal and a symbolic scale with life, death, and resurrection. In short, archetypal arcs are not just about change. They are about change taken to its ultimate endpoint. What was can no longer be. So although your story may or may not feature literal death, what is really meant here is that the arc of one archetype is fundamentally about its own death and subsequent rebirth into the archetype that follows. In Walking on Water, Madeleine L'Engle puts it like this: to be alive is to be vulnerable. To be born is to start the journey towards death. We are moved, into death in order to be discovered. But without this death, nothing is born. And if we die willingly, no matter how frightened we may be, we will be found and born anew into life and life more abundant. So, for instance, the maiden arc is about the death of the maiden archetype within the protagonist and her rebirth into the hero. The arcs are not about becoming the central archetypes. That is, the hero arc is not about becoming a hero, but rather about reaching the apotheosis of that archetype and then transitioning out of the height of that power into death and rebirth. That is, the hero surrenders his heroism and is reborn into the queen archetype. The foundational reason why these 6 arcs are so crucially central to the human experience is because they are all initiatory arcs. Particularly in our modern era, when so many initiatory experiences for the young, much less the adult and even less the elder, have been culturally lost or abandoned, these archetypal stories offer a deep, resonant truth and even subconscious guidance that people crave. Joseph Campbell says, "The passage of the mythological hero may be overground incidentally. Fundamentally, it is inward, into the depths where obscure resistances are overcome and long lost, forgotten powers are revivified, to be made available for the transfiguration of the world. This deed accomplished, life no longer suffers hopelessly under the terrible mutilations of ubiquitous disaster, battered by time, hideous throughout space. But with its horror visible still, its cries of anguish still tumultuous, it becomes penetrated by an all-suffusing, all-sustaining love and a knowledge of its own unconquered power. Something of the light that blazes invisible within the abysses of its normally opaque materiality breaks forth with an increasing uproar." Now, next week, we will begin studying the structural beats and thematic significance of each of the arcs, starting with my take on the maiden arc. Before we dive into the specifics of each individual arc, I want to take a brief moment to discuss a few basic principles that well apply to all the arcs. Principle number 1, not all stories well feature life arc archetypes. So just as not every story features the hero's journey, not every story will necessarily feature one of these specific archetypal arcs. In my experience and study so far, most stories do in fact fit into one of these categories. But just as these arcs are specific variations on the more general premise of the positive change arc, and later the negative change arc and flat arcs, there may also be many variations on these archetypes. And this is especially true for the beats and structures I will be presenting for each positive change archetype. Principle number 2. These archetypal character arcs are not the only archetypal arcs. Archetypes are legion. Many systems exist for categorizing and naming character archetypes, everything from Jungian archetypes to the Enneagram. Almost all of them offer something of validity and are worth studying and implementing in their own right. What I am exploring via these 6 positive change arcs and their related negative and flat archetypes is simply one possible approach to character archetypes within your stories. Principle number 3. A single archetypal character arc can be told over the course of multiple stories in a series. Each of these character archetypes lends itself to a distinct and complete story structure, which can be used to plot a single book. And that is how we will be discussing them. But as all writers know, in agreement with what writing professor John Gardner says in his book, The Art of Fiction, somehow the fictional dream persuades us that it's a clear, sharp, edited version of the dream all around us. But in reality, fiction itself isn't always so clear and cooperative. This means none of these archetypes must be confined to a single book. A character's journey through a single archetypal arc may in fact require multiple books, or even an entire series to accomplish. Principle number 4. Multiple archetypal character arcs can be told in a single story. So, by the same token, it's possible, although much trickier, to combine multiple archetypes into a single larger character arc for a character within a single book. Campbell himself speaks to this. He says, "The changes run on the simple scale of the monomyth defy description. Many tales isolate and greatly enlarge upon one or two of the typical elements of the full cycle: test motif, flight motif, abduction of the bride. Others string a number of independent cycles into a single series, as in the Odyssey. Differing characters or episodes can become fused, or a single element can reduplicate itself and reappear under many changes." And principle number 5. The arcs can be undertaken by any person of any age. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, these arcs can be undertaken by any person of any gender or age. Eudora Welty observed, "The events in our lives happen in a sequence in time, but in their significance to ourselves, they find their own order, the continuous thread of revelation." For example, it is possible to see older characters undergoing a hero's journey. It is even possible to see how these experiences can be repeated within a smaller spiral of experience in every chapter of a human life. Indeed, the entire span of the arcs, from maiden through mage, can be seen mirrored within the individual structure of any one story, something we'll talk about more as we go. Most importantly, don't get hung up on the gendered titles of these arcs. I have retained these titles, hero, queen, etc., precisely because they reflect the masculine and feminine aspects of the journey. But these titles do not indicate that the protagonist must correspondingly be male or female. For example, as is often discussed these days, characters taking a hero's journey need not be male. Carol Pearson notes in the preface to her book, The Hero Within, women's journeys often differ in style and sometimes in sequence from those of men, but the hero's journey is essentially the same for both sexes. More than that, every single one of these arcs is important in its proper order for every person, regardless of gender. Generally speaking, the feminine arcs begin in integration and move to individuation, while the masculine arcs begin in individuation and move back to integration. Both are necessary for wholeness and growth, each leading into the next. I will have more overview notes to offer at the end of the series once we have explored all the archetypes. For now, I hope you're as pumped as I am to dive into this juicy subject. Stay tuned. Next week, we will begin our journey with the Maiden arc. And in the meantime, I hope you'll stop by the site and tell me your opinion. Have you ever studied archetypal character arcs before? If you'd like to be a part of the word player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Amazon Music, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to do something to support helping writers become authors, it always means a ton if you're able to leave just a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Also, many thanks to those who support my work on Patreon. Your patronage helps make helping writers become authors and its many resources available to writers everywhere. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can find out more at patreon.com/kmweiland. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.